Hi, my name is Colleen Flanagan, and welcome to another edition of Odd Talk, #Odd Talk, a weekly video chat series and podcast from the Auditorium Theater. We hope all of you are staying safe and healthy. This week, we have a very interesting chat between the Auditorium Theater CEO Rich Regan and Mark Kelly, the Commissioner of Cultural Affairs for the City of Chicago. Enjoy.
So I want to thank you, Commissioner Mark Kelly, for joining us for today's edition of Odd Talk. I guess I wanted to start by asking how you're doing these days.
Well, we're all in this very strange time that we never could have imagined, but I'm doing fine. I was genetically wired to be an optimist. Intellectually, I might not be an optimist right now, but by dint of personality, I still wake up every day thinking it's going to be a good day, and so I'm doing fine, though obviously it's a pretty difficult period for all of us.
So it's obviously our day-to-day routines have changed significantly. So if you could comment a little bit about how your day-to-day routine has changed and give people a sense of what that's like now.
Well, boy, have I learned how to use Zoom and teammate with Microsoft and all these new platforms, but I am so looking for the day where I don't have to go back on them again, because we're now living on these. So my department, about 60% are teleworking, and 40% have been redeployed. So I have staff who are basically running the food distribution center for the city of Chicago for COVID-19. They're managing housing for medical personnel. They're managing donations and the volunteer services. So all of those heady skills, those producer skills that exist in DCASE have all been repurposed to support the city, and it's very impressive response to the pandemic. And then the rest of the staff continues with their work. Unfortunately, what we're sort of doing is undoing what we have done. Like most of the cultural landscape, we just recently announced the canceling of what was going to be the maiden voyage for Chicago in Tune and House and Gospel and Blues Fest. So I come into the cultural center every day, but there's basically no one here. It's just me and a security guard and a stationary engineer. I could go out into Preston Bradley and scream for 15 minutes and no one would hear me. But our work continues.
Now, you brought up a couple of interesting points. You've described essentially an all-hands-on-deck situation where people from certain departments are being repurposed throughout the city. That's really intriguing information to hear, and getting into food distribution and critical resources for Chicagoans. I think that's really important to note. And if you do walk into Preston Bradley and scream, I would really hope you take a video of that just so you can share it amongst everybody here.
I will do that.
So what you mentioned you're an eternal optimist. In these times right now, is there anything particular that you draw on that keeps you hopeful?
Well, I think more than anything, historical perspective. The human species has always faced not just pandemics, but huge moments of just seismic shifts in what's going on and what happens, and there's much pain and suffering that goes with that, but inevitably the human species comes back, and I'm sure there's going to be some major shifts in how we live in this country because of the pandemic. But in the end, we will go forward. The cultural landscape will return to the public realm. There'll be so many losses, but there'll also be some new thinking, some new energy, some new creativity, and So I think to remind ourselves that this is not the norm, but this is the cataclysmic events are part of the history of the human species.
As we're in this period of isolation with the stay-at-home orders, we're all craving that together experience and that human experience. And I know organizations like the Auditorium Theater and of course Department of Cultural Affairs and Special Events are sort of rethinking how we keep Chicagoans engaged during this period. Is there anything particular that the Department of Cultural Affairs and Special Events has done to address that in this time?
Well, let me just, to the first part of your question, what we're first reminded is no matter what we're doing online, it is never equal to what it is like in person. And if anything, this moment helps us better appreciate what something that, of course, we take for granted when it's there every day. But live theater, live music, live dance, I'm sorry, but all of the great work that's on all these platforms, including what we're doing at DCASE, is necessary and should be there. And it just makes me want for the real thing. That being said, this was going to be the year of Chicago music. It is the year of Chicago music, but we were just about to bust out in this citywide celebration of one of the greatest music landscapes in the world, just when it was about to bust out. And then just last week, we're announcing the cancellation of what was to be a new Chicago Music Festival, Chicago in Tune, and all of our events. We've moved platforms online. Every Sunday, we've taken over the mayor's Instagram account, and there's been 3 performances by Dee Alexander was amongst many, was just a great jazz vocalist, was just performing yesterday. We'll be moving to our Millennium Park online platform, and it'll be a mixture of both some of the great concerts in Millennium Park as well as some of what was going to be the programming in house blues and gospel will come online. We're a partner with Do 312 in the Year of Chicago Music, where there's all kinds of free music available to everyone. And so we're playing our part, but it just makes me all the more eager to get back to that moment when we can be together. We don't know when that's going to be, but boy, I miss that.
We do indeed. And I'm glad you mentioned the Year in Chicago Music, because I believe we heard that was just extended into 2021. Is that accurate? Yeah,
so the Year of Chicago Music, this, as I mentioned, we've brought together the entire music landscape across genre. Never before has everyone come together in this way. We've assembled all of these partners and assets and programs, and now we push it into 2021 so that because the whole point of the Year of Chicago Music is to remind ourselves and the world that we are this great world music capital, and that we begin to act like it and have a little more, if you will, to use a Muddy Waters phrase, a little more mojo in our step about who we are and what we represent. The greatest, one of the greatest collections of authentic music clubs of any city in this country. Our strength across genre. It's not just the great hip hop scene of today, but it's hip hop and it's jazz and it's classical and it's experimental and it's indie, and the list goes on. And then bringing this all together with a brand going out to the world, very exciting. It will continue to be very exciting. Boy, do our music clubs, boy, does our music landscape need our support, especially in recovery, because like so many industries, so many parts of the world we live in right now, it's just been devastated by what's in front of us.
We do love to hear that at the Auditorium Theater, and obviously we're all struggling right now, and not just theaters, but obviously musicians everybody's out of work right now, and we're pining for that time to be together and to have that live experience at one of the amazing concert venues that we have throughout the city. And are those, as we plan for that time, is that the best way that Chicagoans can get involved in your Chicago music?
Well, right now, the best way to get involved, I would argue, is to support the Arts for Illinois Relief Fund. So DCASE is a partner. We committed $1 million to that fund, and that is to both support artists and nonprofit cultural organizations. It's not just music, but music plays a huge role in that. We've raised over $5 million to date. But that's a fraction of the infinite need out there. And I would encourage everyone to, even if it's a $5 donation, to go to the Arts for Illinois Relief Fund and help support our musicians, our actors, our stage professionals. The list goes on in this tough time.
That's a fantastic program. I'm really glad that you mentioned that, and we're all grateful for the support that DCASE has initiated in that program. And speaking of music, the Auditorium has been one of Chicago's most prominent music venues since it first opened in 1889. And we're glad that you've been able to join us at so many of those shows. Do you remember the first time you ever walked into the Auditorium Theater, and what went through your mind as you stepped into the theater?
So I believe I was 18. So this is 51 years ago. I won't even say the date because who needs the date? A long time ago. I wish with all of the storied musical groups that have played at the Auditorium, the band that I went to see does not make the A list, doesn't make the B list. I don't know if it makes the C list. Actually, it was my girlfriend of the time. She wanted to go see him, so it was the Association.
Oh, of course.
Of course, I don't know. But I forget, they had one hit song or two hit songs. And hey, I was a callow youth of 18, so I can't even tell you what my impression was. I think I was too young to even take in at that time what was around me. The power of the Auditorium Theater only came to me because I've probably, I'm making up a number, but what, 100, 200 shows? How many times have I spoken on the stage of the Auditorium? I've been a producer at Columbia. I produced the open house and the commencement program. So such a long history as an audience member and even behind the scenes at the Auditorium. So I have many favorites, but I can't tell you much about my first impression, except I was there, I was on a date, and it was the Association.
That's, now you referred to when you were at Columbia College, and that was actually when you and I first became acquainted, is when you were producing the open houses in the early 2000s at the Auditorium Theater. And something that I always remember you saying, Mark, is that you refer to the Louis Sullivan quote about the theater being soul stirring. And there's a way that you say it, Mark, that inspires everybody who's within earshot. So any chance that I get to hear you say
I can't claim I'm going to be inspiring, but every time I walk into the Auditorium Theater now, without fail, having been in it hundreds of times, it does stir my soul. And that's a Louis Sullivan phrase, that he meant the theater to be soul stirring. And it is, in my mind, the greatest theater I've ever entered, and that it can still take my breath away. The grandeur of it, but there's nothing fancy about the Auditorium Theater. You can feel his that democratic impulse that he was trying to bring. This was going to be a people's theater, and it was going to be accessible, and it was to speak to the common person and not be filled with the ornate sort of grandiosity that goes with a lot of theaters, but something much more subtle and poetic in its presentation. And what an incredible theater to be on the stage looking out, to be in the audience looking up. The arches, the lighting, the murals, the color schemes, they're just sublime.
I had the pleasure of reviewing your keynote address to the students, the graduating class of Columbia College for I believe it was the spring commencement of 2017. And you inspired that graduating class. I kind of wish I was a part of that, and I may actually just save that video and use you as an inspiration from time to time, because it was so compelling. But in that speech, you referenced Louis Sullivan throughout. In particular, you compelled that graduating class to dream big as Louis Sullivan did. And I think what you noted was that he was just 30 years old at the time when he was designing. Do you recall that?
Well, yeah, because so I 32 years at Columbia College. I left Columbia, received an honorary degree, and here it is at the Auditorium Theater where I had selected the Auditorium Theater. And by the way, there's a little bit of a backstory there. We had been at the Chicago Theater, and I will tell you, many of the students were very unhappy when we moved from the Chicago Theater to the Auditorium Theater. And so the start of my speech was, we made the right decision because this is where you want to have your commencement. And this is not meant to be a negative about the Chicago Theater, but in the end, the Chicago Theater, for all the pomposity, it's a bit shallow. It is really sort of like a wedding cake with not much substance architecturally, I would argue, beyond just sort of the size of it. But the Auditorium Theater, I argue to the students, you're inspired by the space, and you're just inspired by the architect, the artist who created it, and reminding them that he created it at 30, and then it's not like he had this gilded journey in life. Alcoholism, the pace of the time turned against the work he was creating. He had very difficult times. Actually, I was trying to encourage students that your fellow students need to be your compass going forward, and not let public taste be your compass, and let your fellow creatives encourage you as you encourage them, and that's where you find your comfort and your inspiration, and not just in the marketplace, if you will. So I was inspired by being in the Auditorium Theater speaking to students, and so used the story of the theater, the story of Louis Sullivan, is a way for the students to imagine their own futures.
This theater, the Auditorium, is one of the most sublime spaces in the world. And I believe it is a particularly fitting setting in which we celebrate your commencement. Let me explain why. The person who shaped what surrounds us was a young artistic renegade. How appropriate. Louis Henry Sullivan chose the path of his art discipline, and he made it his life's work. His profession was in architecture, and his passion was to awaken the creative powers within all people, and to unleash these powers for the shared benefit of all. Also, like you, he was young, arriving in Chicago at the age of 17. As a young, aspiring architect, he was thrilled by the challenge of rebuilding in the aftermath of the Chicago fire. The results surround us. The Auditorium, a masterpiece, started in 1886 when Sullivan was 30 years old.
It was very inspirational, and I think you may have to do a hell yeah speech at a certain point, as we all remain isolated, and we got to remember that we're going to come out of this thing, and we're gonna the value of the live experience is what we all need and what we all have to get back to. So you were there recently when we celebrated our 130th birthday back in December, and we're proud to be one of the oldest performing arts institutions in Chicago. Why do you think the auditorium has prevailed over all these years?
How can it do anything but prevail? When you have such a sublime space, despite all difficulties, it won't be us, but someone will be celebrating its 200th anniversary, and if that were not to be true, then we need to already go to the barricades in defense of the Auditorium Theater. It's such an historic and great place, and look at all of the difficulties the Auditorium Theater has faced over the years. Right, it was dark for 20 years. It was servicemen's hangout during World War II. Tastes do change. What people expect and where they expect it shift. And the auditorium has seen some of that. It's been, at one point you were like the house for great popular music in this city. A great space for dance presentation, a sort of a Broadway house, if you will, and many various audiences, but always the Auditorium Theater will survive and keep going because it is so stirring, and artists want to be in sacred spaces like the Auditorium Theater.
Mm-hmm. It becomes a cornerstone or a foundation for everyone, and it is, given the long history of the auditorium, it's important for us to remember that this isn't actually the first pandemic that the Auditorium Theater has survived through, and that's the last one was the Spanish flu, is what it is referred to. So you had, I asked you a few minutes ago about your first experience at the Auditorium Theater, and you described that. We've been talking about a lot of performances here, but can you zero in on what may be your most memorable concert or performance experience at the auditorium? And it may be tough to narrow it down to one, but if you've got a short list, I think we'd all like to hear that.
Well, I'll give you the short list. Well, first, one would be with my wife Tricia and my daughter Catherine. She's growing up. She's a dancer, and so we were subscribers to Joffrey for many, many years. And it wasn't just Auditorium Theater and Joffrey, but it was also seeing all of this through the eyes of our young daughter, and that we would, 4 or 5 times a year have this experience. It's a pretty treasured series of performances that sort of all fuse into one. The best kind, well, Too Hot to Handle, just having been there just recently, is brings down the house, and so there's that. But there was the Merle Haggard Bob Dylan concert. I'll put Merle Haggard first because I went to see Bob Dylan, but Merle Haggard just blew my mind. This working man songwriter, he was incredible. Bob Dylan was good. Merle Haggard stole the show. Mm-hmm. And then the one that the top of all of them is I think it was just 2 years ago, the David Byrne American Utopia tour. Mm-hmm. This brilliant amalgam of dance and performance and music, and it was extraordinary. And it was a very joyful moment.
So such great shows you mentioned there, and I experienced those all myself, and I have the same reaction to the David Byrne show. I went into it being a big fan of David Byrne, and for many years since I was much younger, and came out of it with a whole new level of respect for his artistry and creativity and his ability to perform. Just a truly amazing show.
So when are you going to bring him back?
I know that's a great question. We need him back. He did a Broadway run for a while, and I think he needs a little break. But we have to work on getting him back. Indeed.
And I've become very enamored of the choreographer who worked with him on that Annie B. Parsons. So maybe he'll bring her with him.
That would be a show to see again. Indeed. Well, Commissioner Kelly, I want to thank you for all of your time here. We really appreciate you joining us on Odd Talk, and we appreciate your friendship over the years as well. Thank you again, Commissioner.
It's been a pleasure. One of my favorite spaces in the world. So always a pleasure to talk about the auditorium.
Thank you indeed.
Thank you.
Thanks so much to the Commissioner for joining us this week, and thanks to all of you for joining us for another edition of Odd Talk, #Odd Talk. We post these every Wednesday at 6 p.m., but you can also find them after on Facebook Live, on YouTube. We also post these as podcasts on SoundCloud and Apple Podcasts. We also have a weekly live performance series every Sunday at 6 p.m. This Sunday, we have Glenn Kochi from Wilco. He'll be performing a solo piece for us. We're super excited. Thanks to all of you. And again, stay safe and stay healthy. We hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.